and welcome to the biology topic, genetics and evolution, lesson 3, natural selection and extinction. We're going to take a look at what natural selection is and where the idea of natural selection and variation came from. We'll also talk about the factors that affect natural selection. Talk a little bit about extinction and endangered species, and then we will also look at seed banks as well and gene banks. So first off, you've got an image here. It may or may not be someone that you recognise, although it is definitely a name that you will know. Okay, so natural selection is when a characteristic of a species becomes more or less common. And this image here is of Charles Darwin. Now, Darwin suggested that through his investigations he did, that variation had led to finches that he studied from different islands having different shaped beaks, and this was as a result of the food that they fed on. So his idea was that their beak shape developed depending on how far they had to dig or where they had to go to get their food, and then that the characteristic was passed on. So what that means is that the variation of those finches will lead to natural selection. So we know that organisms look different due to the different genes that they have. We also know that organisms will compete for resources to survive and reproduce. We need food, water, and shelter, okay, to be able to survive and reproduce. Now, the organisms that are the most successful in getting the food and water will go on. They will also be successful in finding a mate, so they will reproduce and they will pass their genes on to their offspring. Now, because they've been successful, that means they've got genes that allows them to be successful. Now, the organisms that have been unsuccessful will die, so they won't reproduce and their genes are not passed on. So that tells you that the successful characteristics are the ones that are passed on. Okay, now those favoured characteristics will be passed on through generations of organisms, and this will mean stronger, faster, bigger, more camouflaged, bigger leaves, more poison, bigger roots, if we're talking about plants as well, are successful characteristics which lead to survival. Okay, and they will be more likely to survive. Survival equals ability to be able to reproduce. And once you reproduce, you can pass the characteristics on. Now, two good examples of this are giraffes and cheetahs. So giraffes with the long neck, okay, the taller the giraffe, obviously, the higher up that giraffe can reach. So it will reach leaves and food where shorter, smaller or younger giraffes cannot. Okay, so the characteristic of its height will then be passed on. Now, cheetahs, we're talking at this not from a height point of view, but from a speed point of view. If they're faster, they will catch their prey, okay, which means they will get their food. Okay, if they are stronger, they may well get there first, they may well be able to fight to get that prey successfully. Food equals survival, which means they can then pass that characteristic on when they go and reproduce. Okay, so we want survival, that's known as survival of the fittest. Okay, now the other side of that is extinction. And obviously, if something becomes extinct, those genes, those characteristics are gone as well. Okay, so what's really important to remember is extinction means that whole species has died out. The organism will become extinct if it cannot compete. So they're no longer able to reproduce and no members of the species remain. That's very different to being endangered. Okay, endangered meaning it's at risk of extinction. Okay, which is very, very different. You can become at risk of being extinction due to several factors. So again, what we've talked about, lack of mates, lack of food, lack of space. So by default, if there's less and less of your species around, there are going to be less mates for you to be able to reproduce with, which will have an impact. Now, organisms that have become extinct, okay, the dodo, the West African black rhino, the Tasmanian tiger, the bargy white dolphin, okay, they're all extinct species. Now, some endangered species are the black rhino, the Amur leopard, the African forest elephant. So they're all at risk of becoming extinct, but are not yet extinct, whereas the dodo and the West African black rhino are extinct. All right. So the impact of that extinction means that certain things aren't produced. Okay, so we can limit. It will limit resources. So we as humans can be affected by the extinction of a species. Medicines, fuel, clothes are all derived from many animals and plants. Okay, if they become extinct, it will limit the numbers of those resources. Well, if they become extinct, you're not going to have those resources in the long term, okay? Your numbers will be limited because you'll have had so much to a certain point, and then you won't be able to make them. Now, so biodiversity, meaning the variety of different species within a particular habitat, is essential, okay? Because the more you've got in a habitat, the more different species you've got in a habitat, the more you're going to have all over the place. So this impact of extinction, when we're talking about medicines, aloe vera and aspirins are examples, okay? Aspirin used to be extracted from the bark of willow trees, okay? It's now synthetically made, which is a good thing because obviously we're not reliant upon the bark of those willow trees anymore. Aloe vera is extracted from the inside of the plant leaf. It's a really, really thick gel, okay? If that species of plant becomes extinct, we will be really limited on the amount of aloe vera we have, and not everything can be reproduced synthetically. And also, a synthetic reproduction of something doesn't mean it is absolutely identical. So there is an impact of that as well. Now, the next bit that we need to look at is gene banks, okay? And I mentioned this in relation to seeds. So what we need to know is what gene bank is. And it is literally what it says on the tin. So they are a store of genes. So like a bank that we know will store money, these will store genes so that if a species does become extinct, that gene isn't lost, okay? The idea being this links to the genetics and the process of cloning so that we could hope to clone a member of that species if required. And even if we can't clone an exact copy, we can certainly use those genes to reproduce, to help with reproduction, to encourage those genes to be reproduced, to pass on those characteristics still. Now, we know that animal genes are stored in sperm and egg cells, and they're frozen to preserve the genes, okay, and then stored in gene banks. In plants, we have them in the seeds, okay, and they're stored in seed banks, okay. So that, again, remember, we're not always talking about animals and humans. We are talking about plants as well. So the seeds are as important because the seeds will be where that genetic information is held, okay? And then new plants, it's much easier from the point of view of plants. They can be grown from those seeds if a particular species has become extinct or is at risk of becoming extinct. So gene banks are really essential to help keep variation going and to ensure that a species does not become extinct. Okay, that's quite a long lesson this time. So you need to go back and be sure that you're clear on natural selection, factors that affect it, examples, so giraffes and cheetahs and what we talked about, and the difference between a species being endangered or extinct, And then the definitions of the keywords. So remembering that we've talked about Darwin, we've just gone through what gene bank and a seed bank is, and there's differences between the two, and the role that genes and variation play in natural selection. Okay.